At 24 years old, Philip returned to live with the only family members who ever made him feel safe, his uncles, Teddy and Thomas. They were overprotective, caring, and treated him like their own son. But just a few weeks after moving in, Philip realized that the two men he trusted the most were hiding a dark secret, one that would change his life forever. What started as comfort turned into constant surveillance. What felt like love became manipulation, and what he thought was safety became the most dangerous place he'd ever been. This is the true story of how trust can be weaponized, how family can become the very thing you need protection from, and how one young man found the courage to escape. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe. Stories like this help bring awareness and protect others who may be suffering in silence. Philip Matthews grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and family ties ran deep. His childhood wasn't easy. His father left when he was 3 and his mother struggled with addiction throughout most of his early years. While other kids had birthday parties and family vacations, Philip spent his weekends bouncing between relatives' homes, never quite sure where he truly belonged. But through all the chaos, there were two constants in his life, his uncles, Teddy and Thomas. Teddy was the older of the two, a mechanic who owned his own shop in town. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and never raised his voice. Thomas worked as a supervisor at the local factory and had a warmer, more talkative personality. He was the one who remembered Philip's favorite foods, who showed up at school events when no one else did, who made Philip feel like he mattered. The community saw the brothers as pillars of the neighborhood. They volunteered at church, helped elderly neighbors with yard work, and were always the first to offer assistance when someone was in need. To everyone looking in from the outside, Teddy and Thomas were simply two good men who stepped up when their sister couldn't raise her son. They became Philip's de facto parents during his teenage years, and he loved them for it. After high school, Philip wanted independence. He moved to Columbus to work in construction, renting a small apartment and trying to build a life of his own. For 3 years, he worked long hours, saved money, and learned what it meant to stand on his own 2 feet. He called his uncles every Sunday, and they always asked the same questions. Was he eating well? Did he need anything? When would he come home for a visit? But the economy was tough, and construction work became unpredictable. Philip found himself struggling to make rent, sometimes choosing between groceries and utilities. His pride kept him from asking for help, but eventually the financial pressure became too much. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment with an eviction notice on the table, his phone rang. It was Thomas. "Philip, we know things have been hard. Why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you get back on your feet? Your family. You should never have to struggle alone." The offer felt like a lifeline. Philip packed his belongings into his old truck and drove back to the town he grew up in, back to the house where his uncles lived together, back to what he believed was safety and unconditional love. He told himself it would just be temporary, maybe a few months, just long enough to save up and start fresh. As he pulled into the driveway, Teddy and Thomas stood on the porch waiting for him, smiling like they always did. Philip felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was home. Or so he thought. The first week back was everything Philip remembered. Home-cooked meals every night, familiar surroundings, and conversations that flowed easily. Thomas set up the guest room with fresh sheets and even put a small TV in there so Philip could relax after job hunting. Teddy helped update Philip's resume and made calls to contacts who might have work available. It felt good to be cared for again, to not carry everything alone. But by the second week, things started to shift in ways that were subtle at first, almost too small to name. Philip noticed that whenever he mentioned going out to meet friends from high school, Thomas would suddenly remember an errand they needed to run together, or Teddy would mention a project around the house that required an extra set of hands. When Philip said he was going for a drive to clear his head, Thomas would ask where exactly he was going, how long he'd be gone, and whether he needed company. At first, Philip dismissed it as concern. "They're just worried about me," he told himself. "They want to make sure I'm okay after everything I've been through." Then came the questions that felt more invasive. One evening for dinner, Thomas asked if Philip was talking to any women. "You've been on your phone a lot. Is there someone special?" Philip laughed it off, explaining it was just friends from Columbus checking in. But Thomas pressed, "What kind of friends? Are they good influences? You know you need to be careful who you let into your life." Teddy nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed at Philip in a way that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. Philip started noticing that his bedroom door, which he always closed at night, would sometimes be slightly ajar in the morning. Small things would be moved, his wallet in a different spot on the dresser, his jacket hung differently than he left it. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was tired from job applications and interviews, but the feeling persisted. One night around 11, Philip couldn't sleep. He went downstairs to get water and heard his uncles talking in the living room. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, not meaning to eavesdrop, but something about their tone made him stop. "We can't let him leave again," Thomas was saying. "Last time he was gone for 3 years. 3 years, Teddy. We barely heard from him." "I know," Teddy replied, his voice lower, harder. "This time it's different. This time we make sure he understands that this is where he belongs, with us. No one else is going to look out for him the way we do." Philip's stomach tightened. There was something possessive in their words that sounded like not normal family concern. It sounded like ownership. He crept back upstairs, his heart beating faster than it should, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to answer. The next morning at breakfast, both uncles were overly cheerful, asking about his plans for the day and voices that felt rehearsed. Philip mentioned he had a job interview in the next town over. Thomas immediately offered to drive him. "You don't need to waste gas. Besides, I know the area better. I can make sure you get there on time." Philip insisted he could drive himself, but Thomas kept pushing, kept insisting, kept smiling, that smile that no longer felt warm. By the time they returned home, Philip felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the interview. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it yet, couldn't fully articulate it even to himself, but he felt it in his bones. The house that once felt like refuge was starting to feel like something else entirely. 3 weeks after moving back in, Philip got a job offer at a warehouse 30 minutes away. It was decent pay, full-time hours, exactly what he needed. He was excited when he told his uncles over dinner that evening, expecting them to share his enthusiasm. Instead, there was silence. Teddy set down his fork slowly. 30 minutes away? That's pretty far. Philip laughed, confused. "It's not that far. People commute further than that every day." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "What we mean is you'll be gone all day. We barely see you as it is, and you're just getting back on your feet. Are you sure you're ready for something this demanding?" The conversation felt wrong, like they were talking to a child instead of a grown man. Philip tried to explain that this was a good opportunity, that he needed to start earning money again, but every point he made was met with a counterargument. By the end of dinner, he felt defensive and guilty, though he couldn't understand why. He took the job anyway. That's when things got worse. Teddy started showing up in Philip's room without knocking. Philip would be changing clothes or lying in bed reading, and suddenly his uncle would be in the doorway, asking mundane questions that could have waited. "Do you need anything from the store? Did you remember to lock your truck? Are you feeling okay? You look tired." Each time, Philip would startle, feel his privacy invaded, but he'd force a polite response. Once, he woke in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that someone was in his room. He opened his eyes and saw a shadow near his dresser. His heart hammered in his chest. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. The shadow moved quickly, and he heard footsteps retreating down the hall. In the morning, he found his wallet sitting on top of his dresser instead of inside the drawer where he always kept it. When he mentioned it at breakfast, Teddy said he must have left it there himself. Philip knew he hadn't. Thomas's behavior shifted too, becoming more emotionally manipulative. He'd make comments designed to keep Philip feeling dependent and guilty. "We gave up a lot to help you, you know. We could have rented this room out, made some extra income, but we wanted you here because we love you." Or, "It must be nice to have a place to come home to where people actually care. Not everyone is that lucky." If Philip mentioned wanting to save money and eventually move out, Thomas would sigh heavily, his face falling into an expression of deep hurt. "After everything we've done, you want to leave us again? That's really how you feel?" Philip would immediately backtrack, apologizing, explaining that he didn't mean it that way, that he was just thinking out loud. But inside, he felt trapped in a conversation that he could never win. The worst part was the isolation. Whenever Philip's friends from Columbus texted, asking him to visit or offering to come see him, his uncles would find reasons why it wasn't a good idea. "The house isn't presentable for guests right now. You've been working so hard, you should rest this weekend. Those friends didn't help you when you needed it. Why do you owe them anything?" Slowly, Philip stopped responding to messages. It was easier than dealing with the tension and guilt that came afterward. He stopped eating regular meals because sitting at the dinner table meant enduring interrogations disguised as conversations. He stopped sleeping well because he no longer felt safe in his own room. He started losing weight, his face gaunt, dark circles forming under his eyes. Coworkers asked if he was okay, and he'd lie, say he was fine, just adjusting to the new job. But he wasn't fine. Every day felt heavier. Every conversation felt like a chess game where he was always in check. Every moment in that house felt suffocating. Philip started having panic attacks in his truck before walking inside after work. He'd sit in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe, trying to convince himself that he was overreacting, that he was being ungrateful, that his uncles loved him and he should appreciate it. One night, after a particularly long shift, Philip returned home around midnight. The house was dark except for a light in the living room. He quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside, hoping to avoid conversation and go straight to bed. But as he moved toward the stairs, he noticed something. The living room light was coming from his uncle's room, and the door was open just a crack. He heard voices, low and intense. Against his better judgment, Philip moved closer. He couldn't make out full sentences, but he heard his name repeated several times, mixed with words like control and leave and hours. His blood ran cold. He backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, and retreated to his room. He locked the door from the inside, something he'd never done before. That night, Philip lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every strange moment, every uncomfortable interaction, every boundary that had been crossed. He thought about his mother's warning years ago, something she'd said during one of her sober moments. "Those two, they love you, Philip, but sometimes love can look like something else. You be careful." He dismissed it at the time, thought she was just bitter and projecting, but now, in the darkness of that room, her words echoed with a clarity that terrified him. Something was very, very wrong, and he was living right in the middle of it. Before we continue with Philip's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like Philip's matter because they open our eyes to realities that many people face in silence. Abuse doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it wears the face of family. Sometimes it hides behind acts of kindness. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we're supposed to trust the most. As we continue, think about this. How would you feel if you were in Philip's position? What would you do if the people who raised you, who you loved deeply, turned out to be the very people you needed to escape from? These are questions many survivors ask themselves every day. Now, let's return to Philip's story and see how he found the strength to recognize the truth. Philip lasted another week before he broke. One afternoon, during his lunch break at work, he sat alone in his truck eating a sandwich he had no appetite for when his phone rang. It was Marcus, an old family friend he'd known since childhood. Marcus had moved to another state years ago, and they only spoke occasionally. "Philip, hey man, I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up back home?" Something about Marcus's tone, the genuine concern in his voice, made Philip's carefully constructed walls crumble. He hadn't realized how desperately he needed someone to ask that question, someone outside the house, someone without an agenda. Philip's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't know, Marcus. I really don't know." There was a pause on the other end, then Marcus spoke carefully. "Listen, Philip, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to really hear me, okay? This isn't easy to say. Philip's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. Marcus continued, his voice heavy with regret. A long time ago, back when we were maybe 15 or 16, I heard my parents talking about your uncles. They were arguing about whether to say something to your mom or to other family members. There was a situation, years before you were born, involving another relative, a cousin of yours, who lived with them during high school. Apparently, things happened that weren't right. Boundaries were crossed. The cousin tried to tell people, but the family shut it down. They said it would bring shame, that it would tear the family apart. They made him stay quiet. Philip's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. Marcus continued, his voice heavy with regret. My parents decided to not get involved. They convinced themselves it was just a misunderstanding, that it wasn't their business. But my mom never forgot it. When I told her you moved back in with them, she got this look on her face, man. Like she wanted to warn you, but didn't know how. So I'm doing it now. I'm warning you. If something feels wrong there, trust that feeling. Don't ignore it like everyone else did. Philip sat in stunned silence, his sandwich forgotten, his world tilting on its axis. Everything made sense now. The possessiveness, the control, the invasions of privacy, the manipulation. This wasn't just overprotective family love. This was a pattern, and he wasn't the first. Philip, you still there? Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, I'm here. Get out of there, man. I'm serious. Whatever you have to do, get out. When the call ended, Philip sat in his truck for another 20 minutes, staring at nothing, his mind racing through every interaction with his uncles, seeing them now through a completely different lens. He thought about the cousin Marcus mentioned, someone he vaguely remembered meeting once at a family reunion. He'd seemed quiet, withdrawn, and left early without saying goodbye to anyone. Now Philip understood why. How many others had there been? How long had this been going on? And more importantly, what exactly did his uncles want from him? If you believe that more people should hear stories like this so they can recognize red flags earlier, please like this video and comment "Speak Up" below. It helps the algorithm push awareness to those who truly need it. Abuse thrives in silence. The more we talk about these patterns, about manipulation and control disguised as love, the more lives we can protect. Philip's story is not unique. Right now, someone watching this might be living through something similar, questioning their own reality, wondering if they're overreacting. They're not, and neither was Philip. Let's make sure stories like his reach the people who need them most. Now, let's continue and see what Philip does with this devastating information. Philip barely slept that night. He lay in bed, door locked, replaying Marcus's words over and over. Every strange moment, every uncomfortable interaction, every gut feeling he'd dismissed now felt validated and terrifying. By morning, he'd made a decision. He needed to confront this, not directly with his uncles, but by finding a way out. He started by reaching out to Sarah, a woman he worked with who'd become friendly over the past few weeks. During the lunch break, Philip asked if they could talk privately. They sat in Sarah's car, and for the first time since moving back home, Philip told the truth. He described the constant monitoring, the invasions of privacy, the emotional manipulation, the things Marcus had told him about his family's history. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a firmness that surprised him. Philip, what you're describing is abuse. I know they're your uncles. I know they raised you, but this is not normal. This is not love. This is control. Hearing someone else name it, validate it, made something crack open inside Philip. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd been living through. Sarah continued, her voice gentle but urgent. You need to leave. Not next week, not next month. Soon. Do you have any money saved? Philip nodded. He'd been putting aside a portion of each paycheck, keeping the cash hidden in his truck instead of in his room. He had enough for a security deposit and first month's rent somewhere small. Then start looking for a place. Don't tell them. Don't give them any warning. And when you leave, make sure you have someone with you. Over the next several days, Philip began planning his escape in secret. He searched for apartments during lunch breaks, communicated with landlords through email instead of phone calls, and prepared himself mentally for the fallout that would come. But his uncles sensed something. They always did. Teddy started asking more questions. "You've been quiet lately. Is something bothering you? You know you can talk to us about anything." Thomas became more physically present, always in the same room as Philip, always watching. One evening, as Philip sat on the couch pretending to watch television, Thomas sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're not thinking about leaving, are you?" Thomas asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Philip's throat dried. "What? No, why would you think that?" "Because we can tell when you're pulling away. We've known you your whole life, Philip. We can read you better than anyone. And we just want you to know, leaving would be a mistake. You don't have anyone else. Your friends didn't help you when you were struggling. Your mother is still using. We're all you have. And we've given you everything. Don't you think you owe us loyalty?" There was the guilt, the obligation, the invisible chains they'd been wrapping around him since the day he moved back. Philip forced himself to nod, to smile, to play along. "You're right, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just tired from work, that's all." But inside, he was screaming. That night, Philip lay in bed and allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't constantly monitored, where he could breathe without permission, where he could exist without justifying every choice. He clung to that vision like a lifeline. 2 days later, Philip found an apartment. It was small, barely more than a studio, but it was his. The landlord agreed to a quick move-in date. Philip told Sarah and she offered to help him move. They planned it on a Saturday afternoon when his uncles would both be at Teddy's shop doing inventory, something they did once a month. Philip packed only what he absolutely needed: clothes, important documents, a few sentimental items. He left behind anything they'd given him, anything that could be used as an excuse to contact him later. On the morning he was set to leave, Philip went downstairs for breakfast, acting as normal as possible. His uncles were in good moods, talking about plans for the weekend, about a barbecue they wanted to have. Philip nodded along, counting down the hours. When they finally left for the shop, Philip watched from the window until their truck disappeared around the corner. Then he moved fast. Sarah arrived with her boyfriend, and together they loaded Philip's belongings into their vehicles in less than 30 minutes. As Philip walked through the house one last time, checking for anything he'd forgotten, he paused in the living room. This was the house where he'd felt safest as a child, where he laughed and felt loved, but it had become a prison. He took a breath, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. He left a note on the kitchen table. It said only, "I need space to figure out my life. Please respect that. Philip." He knew they wouldn't respect it, but he also knew he couldn't leave without saying anything at all. As Sarah's car pulled out of the driveway with Philip in the passenger seat, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely. But underneath it all, relief. He'd done it. He'd left. The first night in his new apartment, Philip couldn't sleep. Not because he felt unsafe, but because the silence was so unfamiliar. No footsteps in the hallway, no one opening his door unannounced, no voices downstairs discussing him like he was property. Just silence. It was unnerving and liberating all at once. His phone started ringing around 6 p.m. Teddy. Philip didn't answer. Then Thomas called. Then Teddy again. Text messages started flooding in. "Philip, where are you? We came home and you're gone. What's going on? This is ridiculous. Call us back immediately. You're making a huge mistake. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Philip turned his phone off. Sarah had warned him they'd try to manipulate him into coming back, and she was right. The next morning, Philip woke to find 20 missed calls and dozens of messages. Some were angry, some were pleading, some tried to make him feel guilty. One from Thomas read, "We're worried sick. At least let us know you're safe. We love you." Philip stared at that word. Love. He'd spent so long believing their version of love was real, was normal. But love doesn't surveil. Love doesn't isolate. Love doesn't invade. Love doesn't control. Philip knew he couldn't navigate this alone. Sarah had given him the number of a counselor who specialized in family trauma, and after several days of hesitation, Philip finally called. Her name was Dr. Ellen Morris, and she had a calm, non-judgmental voice that immediately put Philip at ease. During their first session, Philip told her everything. The surveillance, the manipulation, the history Marcus had shared, the escape. Dr. Morris listened carefully, taking notes, nodding and understanding. When Philip finished, she leaned forward in her chair. Philip, what you've described is a pattern of coercive control. It's a form of psychological abuse where someone uses tactics like monitoring, isolation, and emotional manipulation to dominate another person. And based on what you've told me about your family history, this isn't the first time your uncles have engaged in this behavior. Hearing a professional name it, categorize it, validate it, was both painful and freeing. Philip had spent weeks gaslighting himself, wondering if he was overreacting, if he was being ungrateful, if he was the problem. Now someone with expertise was telling him he wasn't. But they never physically hurt me, Philip said, needing to understand. Does it still count as abuse? Dr. Morris nodded. Absolutely. Abuse isn't only physical. In fact, psychological abuse can be just as damaging, sometimes more so because the wounds are invisible. What matters is the impact it had on you. And from what you've described, you were living in constant fear and anxiety. You lost your autonomy, your sense of self. That's abuse. Over the following weeks, Philip continued therapy. Dr. Morris helped him understand manipulation tactics, taught him how to set boundaries, and worked with him on rebuilding his sense of identity separate from his uncle's influence. She also encouraged him to consider speaking with authorities or a support organization, particularly given the history Marcus had mentioned. Philip resisted at first. The thought of involving police or making his family's private dysfunction public felt like a betrayal, but Dr. Morris gently pushed back. If there were other victims, and if your uncles are still engaging in this behavior, silence protects them, not their potential victims. You have a choice, Philip, but consider what might happen if you say nothing. That question haunted Philip. What if there was someone else like him right now, another young relative being groomed, manipulated, controlled? Could he live with himself if he stayed silent? One evening, Philip reached out to Marcus again. They talked for over 2 hours. Marcus shared more details about the cousin from years ago, whose name was David. Together, they decided to try to find him. It took some searching, but they eventually located David living in Oregon, working as a teacher, married with 2 kids. Philip was nervous to reach out, unsure if David would even want to talk about something so painful. But he sent a carefully worded email explaining who he was and that he'd recently had a similar experience with Teddy and Thomas. 3 days later, David called. His voice was shaky but kind. "I never thought anyone would believe me," David said. "When I tried to tell the family what was happening, they shut me down so fast, called me a liar, said I was trying to destroy good men's reputations. I was 17 and terrified, so I stopped talking about it. I moved as far away as I could and tried to forget." Philip's heart broke for him and for himself. They talked for hours, comparing experiences, finding eerie similarities in the tactics Teddy and Thomas had used. The surveillance, the guilt trips, the isolation, the invasions of privacy. It was all the same. David had been gaslit into silence, and the family had protected the abusers rather than the victim. By the end of the call, David said something that changed everything. "I'll help you, Philip. If you decide to report this, I'll back you up. I'll tell my story. I should have done it years ago. Maybe if I had, you wouldn't have gone through this." Philip felt a surge of gratitude and determination. He wasn't alone, and more importantly, he had a responsibility to stop this cycle. Whatever fear he felt, whatever loyalty he still struggled with, it paled in comparison to the possibility of protecting someone else from what he and David had endured. 2 weeks after speaking with David, Philip walked into a police station with Dr. Morris by his side. His hands were shaking, his stomach in knots, but he was resolute. He met with a detective named Linda Harper who specialized in domestic abuse and family violence cases. Philip told her everything, providing text messages, describing incidents, explaining the pattern of behavior. Detective Harper listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, taking detailed notes. When Philip mentioned David and the historical allegation, her expression sharpened. Would David be willing to speak with us as well? Philip nodded. He said he would. Over the next few weeks, the investigation quietly moved forward. Detective Harper reached out to David, who provided his testimony. She also interviewed Marcus's mother, who confirmed that there had been concerns in the family years ago that were suppressed. Other family members were contacted, and slowly more pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. It turned out Philip and David weren't the only ones. There was another cousin, now in his 30s, who'd had a similar experience, but never told anyone outside of therapy. When detectives contacted him and explained that others had come forward, he broke down and shared his story as well. The pattern went back decades. Teddy and Thomas had a long history of targeting younger male relatives who were vulnerable, who needed help, who trusted them. They'd perfected the art of appearing benevolent while slowly tightening their control, isolating their victims, and ensuring silence through shame and family pressure. During this time, Philip's uncles attempted to contact him relentlessly. When phone calls and messages didn't work, Teddy showed up at Philip's workplace. Security had to escort him off the property after he refused to leave. Thomas sent letters to Philip's apartment, long rambling pages filled with accusations, guilt trips, and veiled threats. One letter read, "You're destroying this family with lies. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? Everyone will know what kind of person you really are. Ungrateful, manipulative, a liar." Philip showed the letters to Detective Harper, who documented them as evidence of harassment and intimidation. The more they tried to control him from a distance, the more they revealed their true nature. The case built slowly, but it built solidly. Coercive control and psychological abuse are difficult to prosecute because they leave no physical evidence, but the consistency of multiple testimonies over decades painted a clear picture. The district attorney's office eventually decided to pursue charges related to harassment, stalking, and endangerment. While the legal process was complex and frustrating, the important part was that the truth was finally on record. The family could no longer pretend. The community could no longer look away. When word got out about the investigation, the response was divided. Some family members were angry, accusing Philip of tearing the family apart over misunderstandings. They posted on social media defending Teddy and Thomas, calling Philip and the other victims vindictive and attention-seeking. But others, especially those who'd had their own uncomfortable experiences or suspicions over the years, quietly reached out to Philip with messages of support. One aunt sent a letter that made Philip cry. "I always felt something was off, but I told myself I was imagining things. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. I'm so sorry I didn't protect David. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up." The hardest part for Philip wasn't the legal process or even the family backlash. It was reconciling the two versions of his uncles in his mind. The men who'd taken him to baseball games and helped with homework, the men who'd made him feel loved when no one else did, and the men who'd violated his autonomy, invaded his privacy, and manipulated him psychologically. Dr. Morris helped him understand that both could be true. People are complex. Abusers can genuinely care for their victims while still harming them. That doesn't make the abuse acceptable, and it doesn't mean Philip owed them anything. What mattered now was breaking the cycle and healing. In a small courtroom 6 months after Philip first walked into the police station, Teddy and Thomas stood before a judge. They'd been issued restraining orders preventing them from contacting Philip, David, or the third cousin who'd come forward. They were also mandated to attend counseling and faced probation for harassment charges. It wasn't the dramatic justice that movies portray, but it was something. More importantly, it was a public acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. Philip attended the hearing, sitting in the back row with Sarah beside him. When the judge read the restraining order terms aloud and warned Teddy and Thomas that any violation would result in immediate arrest, Philip felt a weight lift from his chest that he'd been carrying for months. As they left the courtroom, Thomas turned and locked eyes with Philip for just a moment. There was anger there and something else. Disbelief, maybe, like he genuinely couldn't understand why Philip had done this, why he'd betrayed them. But Philip held his gaze, unflinching. He had nothing to apologize for. He'd survived. He'd spoken up. He'd protected others. That evening, Philip stood on the small balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city lights, and allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet kind that comes from doing something difficult because it's right. He thought about David and the other cousin, about the chain of silence that had finally been broken. He thought about his younger self, the kid who'd been so grateful for his uncle's love that he'd overlooked every red flag. And he forgave that kid, because he'd been doing the best he could with what he knew. They all had been. Healing didn't happen overnight. There were days when Philip woke up angry, furious at the years stolen from him, at the trust that had been weaponized, at the family members who still refused to believe him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, his mind replaying moments he wished he'd handled differently, words he wished he'd said. But slowly, with Dr. Morris's help and the support of the small circle of people who believed him, Philip began to rebuild himself.